In the previous lesson, we were looking at how to apply configurations for props. And in particular, we have looked at how to assign certain types for props. And now we're going to review one more important configuration option, with which we can apply custom validation rules for individual properties. Let's start with this example. Base select component receives array of options in the options property, and every object in this array should have a certain shape. It should consist of label and value properties. But currently, we don't enforce this restriction. So there is nothing stopping us from sending objects which may not contain one of these properties, label or value. And in order to ensure that the value that will be passed under options prop, we will add one more configuration option into this options object, which is called validator. This option receives function, which in turn receives value of the prop, which we're currently validating. Let's call this parameter options. And here we're gonna check that all objects that are being passed into this options array have certain shape. We're going to iterate over every object by using every method. This method accepts callback, and the first parameter into this callback will be an object from the options array. And we can destructure this object right here by extracting properties value and label. And in order for this object to be valid, it should have two properties, value of type number and label of type string. We're gonna describe this logic right here and check types. Type of value should be a number and type of label should be a string. And now let's go back to timeline item component and try to change shape of these objects. We're gonna remove value property from the first object. And instead of using string for the label property in the second object, we're gonna use number. And now our custom validation should display some warnings in a console. And indeed, we can see those warnings. So our validation works perfectly. Now let's revert changes in this object and switch to the now component. This component accepts one property, current page. Here we can also try to apply custom validation. Let's add key validator. And in here we should somehow validate that the value passed to current page property should match one of the existing page names. And all valid page names we can extract from nowItems object. As we can see, this object consists of keys that correspond to every page name. And all those page names are defined as a separate constants right here. So back to our validator, and right here we can easily extract keys from nowItems object. This way we're gonna get array of valid page names and then call method includes on this array if current value that was passed into current page prop matches one of the valid page name. Let's check it out by sending invalid page name into this property from the app component. And just like that, we can see that the warning has appeared saying that the validation failed for property with the name current page. So let's discard this change and go to the next component, timeline item. In the same way, we're gonna add validator property into timeline item configuration object. And here we're gonna write validation logic that the timeline item object has correct shape. In order for this object to be valid, it should have a property hour, which should be a number, and this hour property should have value which is included in a certain range. Since this should be a valid hour, it should be greater or equal to 0. And at the same time, it should be less than 24 hours. And we already have a constant which stores this value. It's called hours in day. So all we have to do in here is to import this hours in a day constant from constants file. And just to reduce the amount of code inside of validator, we can destructure our property in the parameter list and reference this property directly. And now let's try to make this validation fail. First of all, we have to determine where that array of timeline items is generated. It happens on this line within app component by using function generate timeline items. And if we take a look at this function, which is located inside of functions.js file, we will see in here for a loop which adds objects to a timeline items array. And all these objects contain our property. And if we manually try to assign invalid hour to this property, for example 25, and check the result in the browser, we can see that our validation works. And we see a warning related to invalid value being passed to timeline item prop. And finally, let's define one more validator for property timeline items within the timeline component. Let's create a validator which is going to go over all elements inside of timeline items array and check that every object within this array corresponds to a certain shape. And luckily we already wrote validation which can be reused in here. And this validation is located within timeline item component, which checks individual timeline item objects. And since we should do pretty much the same validation in here, we just have to run this validation for every object inside of timeline items array. So let's paste this chunk of code in here, then convert this to an arrow function, destructure our object property within parameters, and that's all we need to make sure that the passed array inside of timeline items prop will have a valid form, and every object within this array will have a valid value for the hour property. And now let's just copy over the import of a constant hours in a day and paste it inside of the timeline component. And that is it for this lesson. We have seen how to apply custom validation rules for props.